Hey, just a heads up that the following content may be disturbing or triggering for some listeners and is not appropriate for children. Please take care of yourself and others who may be listening with you. Welcome to the Bonus Babies Podcast, a show that has no easy answers, only hard questions.
I think the bigger problem is, how do we address the smoke that's rising from families before it turns into a full-fledged fire, right? Like if there's a challenge with addiction or mental health and other things like that that are serious red flags that we have tremendous interventions for. And it's how do we get those in front of the right people? And how do we make sure that children aren't going to bed hungry? And, that families aren't living in extreme poverty that makes them more susceptible to the child welfare system.
Can you tell me what you call the kids who you've cared for over the years?
We feel that the children that we receive coming into our home are bonuses. So we call them bonus babies.
I love that. This is your host, Jane Amelia Larson, and I'm a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate volunteer for youth in foster care. Yeah, I know it's a mouthful. In the same way a CASA works, I explore all things in the foster care maze by talking to kids, parents, caregivers, attorneys, social workers, therapists, really anybody and everybody who will speak to me to keep the conversation open and the information flowing about all things CASA.
Hi, this is Jake Eberly, the producer of the Bonus Babies Podcast, and today Jane Amelia speaks with Mark Daley. Mark is a social activist, entrepreneur, and foster-turned-adoptive father. He has over 2 decades of experience in message development, communication strategy, and public policy, and he is the founder of One Iowa, the state's largest LGBTQ+ equality organization, and thefosterparent.com, a national platform to connect interested families with foster organizations. He's got a great story. Here's Mark Daley.
Hi, this is Jane Amelia Larson, and I'm here with Mark Daley. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me, Jane.
Good. So you have just written a really important book, and I read it a couple months ago, and I've just been refreshing myself. And what I'm so impressed with is how comprehensive it is, and so detailed, and so informative, and yet truly so moving. Really, it's like a really terrific personal account.
Oh, thank you so much.
It's just wonderful. I'll put all this in the show notes, but the book is called Safe, a memoir of fatherhood, foster care, and the risks we take for family, which I just love, right? And I so appreciate that because we do take risks for family, and you really, really did. So I want to hear all about that. But first, I want to hear about who you are and what is your family of origin. I know that both you and your husband have some lived foster care experience. So talk to me about that and anything else you want about your own family.
Sure. I grew up in a family where I have 3 cousins who entered our family through the foster care system. And so for me, foster care wasn't really foreign. Now, granted, I was 8 years old when the first one arrived, so I don't really remember what the process was like or how it worked. And honestly, I don't know what his story was before he entered our family. All I knew was, I was 8, he was 7, he came in, he liked G.I. Joe, so did I, and we hit it off, and that was it. And so when my husband Jason and I decided to pursue building a family, foster care was always something we talked about. We had looked at surrogacy and ultimately decided that foster care felt right for us.
Right. And that's because you saw the terrific impact that it had in your family and also the opportunity that you and your husband could do to make a difference for kids in need, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was no doubt we wanted to grow our family. And, the more I learned about foster care, after having gone through the process, I realized that growing your family through foster care is not really probably the right motive to get into it. It's because foster care's goal is to reunify kids with their parents, right? It's to help parents who are going through probably the most difficult time of their life and children who ultimately are doing the same as well, and help them heal and reunify. But, in our case, we didn't really know that going in is clear, or we didn't want to hear that as much because my experience was there was a child in need and there was a family that was willing to love them, and that's what we wanted to be.
Yeah, I understand that because people do think of foster to adopt, and
Yeah.
it's a baby, and then that baby is with you forever. And as you said, and you talk about very well in the book, that is not the goal of foster care in most states. It is to reunify. And what is very difficult about that, as you know and you experience, is kids can get reunited with their bio families and then still go back into the system,
Right.
not once or twice or maybe even 3 times. So, will you talk to me about the first 2 boys that you had and then their sister as well?
Yeah. So, Jason and I, we were newlyweds. We wanted to grow our family. We had looked into surrogacy, decided ultimately that foster care was the way to go. And, when you start to do this, you go through a training and they come out and they inspect your house to make sure, your house is safe and so on. And when they got to our house, they said, "Oh, you have a big house. Would you consider siblings?" And what I interpreted that to mean was, if mom has a baby down the road, can we call? Not, we were going to have 2 little kids for you at once.
Like right now.
Yeah, I totally misunderstood. So I was like, yeah, sure, of course. And of course, Jason looked at me like I had 9 heads, and it didn't register that I was saying something wrong. And so, of course, when we were approved, they had stored this in their head because there are so many sibling sets that come into care. And the worst thing you could possibly do is break them up, right? So we had said, you can't say, "I just want an infant, I just want a newborn." But you can say, "I want 0 to 3" was an age range. So we said 0 to 3. And so when they called, they said, "We have 2 boys. They're 3 months and 13 months old. And, are you willing to do it?" And so after asking a series of questions, we had learned, obviously, at this point about reunification as obviously a goal. And of course, we support reunification. We'd never want to take babies from someone who was capable of caring for their children and so on and keeping them safe. But so we thought, what are the right questions to ask to make sure that, we're going to be in a situation where it ends up in adoption? And we asked a whole bunch of questions, and really it just looked like this was going to be a case where there was no way they were going back. And so we said yes. And, the 2 boys that in the book I call Ethan and Logan, arrived at our house a couple hours later, and we then became their dads for a period of time.
That's right. And it would a lot of work and a lot of love, right?
Absolutely, as any parent will tell you that.
Yeah. And then you ended up with their sister for some time, right? Their baby sister?
We did not. No. So what happened was, you know, about midway through, the parents really hadn't been doing very much. They had been kind of meeting here and there with them, but not really seeing them very often and not really calling. And but at a certain point, the parents started to do what the court had ordered them to do. They went to seek rehab for drug addictions and stuff. And so it was a turning point for us because obviously we certainly didn't want to root for anybody to fail. Of course, you would never root for someone not to get over their addiction. But they started to make progress as well. And we also learned that the mom was pregnant, and she entered a facility that allowed her to keep the little girl with her, which was wonderful. That she was able to keep her daughter. In fact, I wish there were more facilities that allowed parents who are dealing with addiction to keep their children with them, because I think that's probably a reason a lot of people don't get treatment in the first place. So anyway, she was able to take her daughter with her, and we maintained relationship with them with the boys. As we progressed through our case, and I'm giving some spoilers to the book here, but after about a year, year plus in, but they had said to us that we're going to give you another 6 months on this, where they'll stay with us, and at the end of that, they'll determine whether or not the boys should return to their mother and father or not. And I think everyone, including the birth parents, were on board with that decision at the time. And then all of a sudden, we got this email that said, the mom had initially appealed the detention, meaning the kids never should have been taken from her in the first place. And she won the appeal, which, we had been told all along in our training and our social workers that there was absolutely that never happens. Parents never
Right, so that came out of the blue, that you were totally blindsided.
Totally. And it was about, 15 months after the kids were in our care, we got this email that was like, "Oh, remember that appeal she filed when they were detained? Well, she won." And so what had happened was the 3-panel judges unanimously ruled in her favor that the kids should not have been detained, and that it was a mistake on the juvenile court's, part to detain the kids in the first place. And so, we it wasn't that we were opposed to them going back ever. We never, we certainly thought like there was a potential that maybe they would be able to care for them and keep them safe. But what at that time, we just didn't feel like they were ready. They didn't have a place to live yet. They didn't have, there was a lot going on. She had a newborn. They were still at their respective, treatment facilities, and like there was just a lot going on. We're like, I don't know if this is the best decision at this time. Like maybe wait, a few more months, and then great, and we would have been on board with that. But at this point, we're like, this is a terrible idea. And so, but ultimately, we felt like our anything we were saying was sort of being met with, well, they just want to adopt. It's like, no, we actually really just care for the kids. And so. Anyway, they ultimately reunified with their biological parents.
And you were heartbroken, I'm sure, right?
I was heartbroken, of course, I talk about this in the sense of like, I definitely was heartbroken in that I love these kids, but it was not so much on the fact that like I couldn't be their parent, which certainly that was upsetting to me, but more so was that I lived in this constant state of fear that something was going to happen to them.
Right, and you described that really well in the book. It's kind of terrifying. It's like watching a train wreck, or not a train wreck, but a potential train wreck, like knowing something's going to happen.
Yeah. And we did everything we possibly could have done. We reached out to, anyone involved in the courts and the social workers and so on. And there were some people who totally agreed with us, but they just didn't have the power to make the decision either. It wasn't, once that appellate court ruled, that was it. There was really not much anyone could have done. The county could have appealed it, but they didn't, for whatever reason. And I've later learned that, part of that is probably because it's so rare that somebody actually wins their decision,
Mm-hmm.
in some instances, but then also sometimes too, it's probably just kind of covering themselves. It's like, let's make sure that this case is not something that can be cited as precedent moving forward.
So I'm curious about the title of the book. Why you chose to land on the word safe?
Well, I'll tell you, the initial word was protection, but we actually thought it sounded more like condoms, and so we
Right.
changed it. But I think safe really has many meanings, right? It's this idea that really, and I say this to my children now, is that my job is to make sure that you're safe, right? It's above and beyond anything else. I need to make sure that you're safe. And I think that it's that. So it's a parent's job to keep a kid safe. And it's also just, for a child, it's knowing that they're safe, feeling safe. It's kids in school can't learn if they don't feel safe. There's, kids at home can't function properly. They can't sleep properly. They can't if they don't feel safe. And so I just think it's so critical. So that was really where we came from, with the title.
So, after reading your book and also knowing a little bit about you, you're kind of an expert now in in what's happening in the foster care system. Did you have an interest beforehand, or did this all like blow up as a result of your own personal experience?
Oh no, it absolutely blew up because of my experience. I had done a little bit of work with like some nonprofits in the foster care space that had done mostly with kids who age out of foster care. So every year there's about 20,000 kids nationally who become adults without having become adopted or finding a legal guardian in that. And so they call them aging out, foster youth. And so, and these kids have some of the worst outcomes you can imagine, more likely to end up incarcerated, pregnant, homeless, so on and so forth. So I've done some work with nonprofits, so I knew some of that. And then obviously I had a personal family connection to it. But once I got involved with it, what would happen is as we were living through this state of limbo of like, are the kids going to stay? Are they going to go? What does it look like? I started just researching, and I would stay up late at night, looking at like Google Scholar and all these, what studies are out there. And then sometimes I would reach out and contact the PhDs that wrote these journal entries and ask for more insight and figure out, is this real or is this outdated or what else can be done and so on. So it was, I just really threw myself into it. And now I had sold my company that I owned at the time. And now I actually consult for child welfare agencies around the country. The biggest one here in California, of course, California Department of Social Services. and I help them recruit foster parents online.
Yeah, I just learned that. So can you talk to me a little bit about that? That's so interesting because you've had a tough time of it, but you're still kind of a poster child of what could work, right?
I think here's the thing is I think, and this is why I wrote the book in many ways, is I think that becoming a foster parent can be such a beautiful gift to offer another family or a child, right? And obviously if you end up growing your family from it, it's what a tremendous reward as well. But the reward of helping another family heal is so huge. That being said, there's a lot of things that you should know going in. And I think that's really part of why I wrote the book. I wanted people to not only consider this, but to go into it with their eyes wide open. We didn't have them wide open. In part, we had baby fever. We were excited. We wanted a baby. This was going to be our family. It was amazing. But, we didn't really think about that every adoption, whether it's foster care or private adoption, begins with a loss, right? I mean, you can't adopt a baby if that baby hasn't lost their connection to their biological parents, and so that is not an easy thing to accept always, and I wanted that to be very clear to people.
I think you do a really good job of it,
Thank
and
you.
because your story is pretty inspiring. It's heartbreaking, but certainly inspiring. And my personal view on this is that if we had better foster parents in this country, and if we had more services to keep families intact, so many we'd have so many better outcomes.
I agree, and I think you really hit the nail on the head too when you said, better services for families. I think the bigger problem is how do we address the smoke that's rising from families before it turns into a full-fledged fire, right? Like if there's a challenge with addiction or mental health and other things like that that are serious red flags that we have tremendous interventions for. And it's how do we get those in front of the right people, and how do we make sure that children aren't going to bed hungry, and that families aren't living in extreme poverty that makes them more susceptible to the child welfare system.
Right. And then, of course, why do we throw money at strangers to take care of kids instead of investing in the families to keep them intact?
Absolutely. In every state, there's a push. And California is really leading the way. I'm proud of them for this in making sure that we try to keep the kids within their family of origin. There's a lot less trauma when a child moves to their grandparent or their aunt or their uncle than they move, across the county to a stranger, and, maybe a stranger of a different race even, and whatever else. There's just a lot less trauma. And so they're doing a good job of how do we recruit more immediate family members, the nearest, most responsible adult family member who can step up and take in kids. But that being said, in some instances, that's not possible. That person doesn't exist. The person doesn't have a big family, whatever it is. We need foster families and and adoptive families as well.
So I have now a second casa kiddo. My first kiddo was likely adopted with a family member who I identified, and that had been
Amazing.
lost kind of in the pile of paperwork, right? And she's now happily adopted. And my little girl now, she's lucky. She right now has this fantastic foster mom who's just like, I wish I could clone her. She's just so attentive, engaged, supportive, holds the kids accountable. There's boundaries, there's rewards. I mean, all the good stuff you have in a family. But even so, my little casa kiddo does not yet have any kind of permanency. And I can see it chipping away at her.
I feel this is where my heart breaks. First of all, I love that your involvement in CASA. Thank you for doing that. It's such a tremendous gift to these kids. But I think about this all the time. It's like, how do you look to the future and have a vision of what your life's going to be when you don't know where you're going to be living in 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, right? You don't know what opportunity is going to be available to you, you know? And if you take a risk, who's going to be there to help you pick up the pieces if it doesn't go? And that's really, to me, that's the hardest part for these kids. It's, I mean, I struggled with, I'm not, I used to talk about this in the book. I'm not a person who lives in the gray very well. That like, if yes or no, like it's, I've struggled with that my whole life. And I think a lot of people do. I think it's very common. But imagine being a child, when can I see my parents again? When can I call my parent again? Am I going to see them again? And then where am I going to live? When? What school? Do I need another teacher, new friends? It's just, I can't imagine that sort of mental anguish, you know?
Yeah, I can see it in her. I feel, and I'm just very curious about how you feel about how the system works in general. I am disturbed by the glacial rate at which things happen in the foster care system. What has been your experience with that?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, here's the thing is it's shortages, right? I think the more I'm exposed to it, I do see that there are so many wonderful people who are so well-meaning and well prepared for their jobs, but they're so short-staffed. We had a social worker who had 45 cases,
Yeah,
which
way too
means
many, way too
she
many.
has to go to 45 houses once a month. How do you do that? To check in on these kids and then file all the necessary paperwork and do the follow-ups. If a foster parent's like, hey, we're talking, we need this and we need that, or we need, I need a referral for a therapist, I need a referral for speech pathology, or, where do they have the time? I mean, it doesn't happen. And I think the fundamental flaw is that there's just not enough funding or people involved, to help these kids in that
Yeah,
sense.
and I don't think it's going to get better right now. It's looking like,
Oh
right?
God.
Unfortunately, I think it's probably going to get worse.
It's it's so frightening. It is absolutely horrific.
So you are married to a man, and this is the first time maybe in history where it's not incredibly difficult to adopt or to foster a child when you're in a same-sex marriage. And how has that journey been?
Well, we're in California, so it definitely
Yay,
wasn't
California.
challenging here. So I will say that, and in Los Angeles too, I mean, California has been absolutely wonderful and supportive. You know, I'm thrilled to have the experience we've had. I know that that is not the same for people in other places in the country. And I think, and that's really a shame because LGBT families are far more likely to foster and exceedingly more likely to adopt than, opposite sex couples. And that's
And you
really
have the stats to back that up in your book, which I think is fascinating. It's like,
absolutely.
yeah.
I think it's 4 times. It's from the Williams Institute. But I didn't want to say it off the top of my head without knowing for sure. But I believe it's 4 times more likely to foster and adopt than opposite sex couples. So, which makes sense. I mean, there's an obvious barrier to parenthood, when it comes to anatomy, and so there's that. And also, the other sense too is that, for LGBT people, we grew up in an area, I'm a Gen Xer, right? And we grew up in a time where it wasn't always accepted. And to many people around the country, that's still the case, right? And you kind of search for this sense of belonging, and we have a real meaning on your chosen family is a really big deal to you. It's not just your biological family, but your chosen family is on par with your biological family. And that's probably something that is, somewhat unique to us in a different way. And so when you think about what does that mean to become a foster or adoptive parent, and you layer that in, it's like we take that very, very seriously. I had a social worker say to me when we were going to the training, she said, anytime we get a call from, a gay couple, we immediately like jump up because we know that there's a lot of planning that went into this call.
Wow,
There's,
that's fascinating. Yeah.
yeah, they know that we're serious. We've thought about it. We've talked about it.
The experience of that you've been through the last now, it's probably almost 10 years, right? Or a little, maybe a
Yeah.
little less than that. So how has it changed you as a man, as a person?
I think, it's interesting. It's exposed me to a lot of, I've learned so much about trauma and about being, trying to lead with empathy, I guess, in some way, circumstances, right? Knowing that my experience is different from everybody out there. And that's whether that's, the person who cuts you off, on the 101, or the person who makes your coffee, or your own child or your spouse, right? I mean, it's everybody has moments and things that they're going through. And I think day to day, I just try to be more aware of that. It doesn't always work, but none of us are perfect. But it's trying to understand that, we've all gone through different things, and all of our journeys are different. And so we're looking at things differently. But that means we should be able to be there for one another, listen and help when we
And
can.
was there ever a point where your relationship was on the rocks because of the stress of everything that happened and regarding kids who you had and then couldn't keep?
We have a really solid relationship, thankfully. I will say that, after the boys reunified, it was hard for us because, if you think about the stages of grief, this like anger, acceptance, denial, all these different things that you go through, you don't necessarily go through them at the same time. And so, when I'm being angry, my husband might be in acceptance. And at that point, we can't talk because whatever we're going to talk about is it's not going to be productive. I need to call that friend that's going to listen to me vent and, and help me deal with it. And likewise, he needs to do the same thing around acceptance. So there were times where we felt a little bit, removed from one another or detached. But ultimately we're able to come back together. We ended up keeping our license open because we knew what would happen was that they were coming back into care. And it was just a matter of time. And that's what, so we stayed active as foster parents. We didn't close our home off to that. We wanted to be the one for them to call when they came back in. So that was really our plan.
Right. So then a year passed, right? And then you got another phone call.
So yeah, a girlfriend of mine who was fostering, and I had talked to her throughout her journey of like becoming a foster parent and whether or not she felt like it was right for her. She had gotten sort of a slam dunk case, or she got a baby, and 6 months later they were moving to adoption. And at a certain point, you go from having a traditional caseworker to an adoption worker as well when your case is moved to permanency there. And her adoption worker was at her house doing a visit, and she said, and just in conversation mentioned, I was just out of LA County, and we had these 3 siblings that were put on a caseload, and I had to move them out of county because I couldn't find a home in LA big enough that would take them. And, they were just these amazing kids, but I'm never going to find them a home. So, and just sort of talking about her job, and my girlfriend just chatty said, well, I have these friends, and told her about us. And she said, well, ask them if they'd be interested. And so I got a text message from Devin, and I read it. Jason wasn't home. I kind of just like put it down and kind of forgot about it, initially. And then a couple hours later, Jason came home and we were talking, and I said, hey, I got this text from Devin. And he said, well, why don't we find out their story? And I was like, oh, really? This is like, you do this, And so we, the next day we're on a call with the social worker, and that I think it was on a Friday. And then on Monday we met with her in her office, and they put us in what's called like a potential match, it means exclusively dating in the foster care speak, where
exclusively dating. I see.
Yes, we can't get another kid and they can't get another family. And then ultimately, we met and took them in, and that's my children, Amy, Eddie, and Joshua, who at the time were 6, 5, and 2.
Wow.
But so, yeah. So they moved in with us, and then about 6 months out, and we were going through the honeymoon period and the learning curves of where do we all fit in the family, and things were going really, really well. And then we got a call from LA County that the original boys, Logan and Ethan, were back in care with their younger sister, and would we take them as well, and would we have 6 children?
It was a hard choice, right?
It was absolutely awful. And so our initial reaction was, yes, absolutely, let's do this. And the nonprofit that we had contracted with to become foster parents that licensed us said, well, before we call the county back to tell them, yes, let's all jump on a conference call here and talk this through. And, they said, look, when the boys left your care, they were doing great, but it's been over a year now. It's, basically a year and a half at this point, and they're not the same kids, and they've gone through some trauma, and they were detained this time because of some suspected abuse. And so would you, it's going to be different. And you already have 3 kids, and they have their own things that you're dealing with. So would you be able to handle all this? And ultimately, really, I said no. Jason, I think, still to this day hasn't said no. But it was one of those, we had to do it together, obviously. And I was just like, I don't think we can. I think our job is to care for the 3 that are in our care. And about a year and a half later, we finalized our adoption on Amy, Eddie, and Joshua.
Wow, I'm sure that broke your heart to make that decision because you love those first kids. I'm calling them first kids, but you love them.
Yeah, Absolutely. No, it was gut-wrenching. It was absolutely, the most difficult thing I've had to do was to decide that I couldn't parent them, when all I had wanted for so long was to parent them.
Right, and you don't have any sense now what's happening with them, right? Or do you?
I don't really know. The last that I did know, they were living with their dad, and I don't know how well the situation is there, but they're with their dad. So, they did go back into care, where they were separated from their sister and then ultimately all reunified with the father about a year later.
So speaking of fathers, can you tell me about that moment in court when you met the biological father of the kids you have now? Can you
Yeah.
kind of describe that for me?
Yeah, I mean, so just to sort of set it up, we had gone into court for the day that they were supposed to be terminating the parental rights of Amy, Eddie, and Joshua. And, this is a hearing that wasn't going to be a good hearing for their parents, and they hadn't really come to other hearings, so we didn't expect them to be there. But when we were walking in, I just looked across the room and I saw this woman, and she just looked just like Amy, only taller and older, and but just as beautiful and everything else. And I, grabbed Jason by the arm and I was like, that's got to be their mom. And he was like, why do you say that? I'm like, look at her. I mean, it couldn't be more, and he was like, you're right. And then as we were sitting in there, all of a sudden their dad came walking in. And again, I didn't realize it was the dad at the moment, but the way that he was looking around the room, I knew that I put one and one together. And of course, he went to go sit at the table with his attorney. And so he was looking around the room, and I was thinking to myself, God, he's got a message to deliver to somebody. He's going to say something to somebody in here, because he was looking for somebody in that crowd. And all of a sudden our eyes met, and I realized it was me. And at the moment, he just looked at me and he mouthed, thank you. And I didn't even know how to respond. So I just kind of like froze, and he said it 2 more times. And then I said something like, of course, I do anything for our kids, which I'm sure he couldn't tell what I was saying from across the courtroom while I was mouthing it. But it was that moment of just, I didn't know how he was going to react. We're about to take his children, and, but we have a shared love of them, and there's nothing he wouldn't do for them. There's nothing I wouldn't do for them. And I believe he knew that. And I had actually talked to him after that court hearing, not before but before the book came out. And he had said to me that, we submit a form where we tell the judge how everything is going at home. And if there's any challenges or other things that we need help on, we're able to do that as foster parents. And so I knew that all of the parties to the case get a copy of the form, right? So that he would get one, and, their mom would get one, and the judge and the attorneys and everybody involved would get one. So I wrote it because I wanted the judge to know that they were doing well and that they were thriving, and that, yes, there were some things that we were working on, but that they were getting the care that they needed, and that above and beyond, they were, well taken care of and loved beyond belief. And so I wrote this really sweet note about them and really personalized who they are in it. And what I realized is he had read it while he was waiting to come in. And I think that was, for him, this moment of like, okay, I can't do this, but there's somebody out there that's going to do it. And he has told me on the phone, he's like, thank you for giving them everything I can't.
How did that make you feel?
Oh, I'm going to cry now just thinking about it, Jane. Thanks. It felt wonderful, but it also feels hard because, look, I grew up in a working class family. I've had a lot of privilege in my life. I am a white man. I am, so there's a lot of things that I was given that he wasn't. And, if he had been given half of what I had been given, would he have been in the same situation? Probably not. And so there's a lot of pain that I have in the way that I think the systems have failed him along the way. But ultimately, I know that he loves his kids and as much as I do.
Would you be willing to read something from your book? Do you have a
Yeah.
copy there? I see one behind you, but I'm hoping you have one in your hand as well.
Absolutely. I've got one right here. I'll read you the prologue.
Okay, great.
It says, I want to write this story like a fairy tale. I want it to be a love song, something Taylor Swift would write. I want to romanticize the plight of a young woman on a bus that smelled like diesel and potato chips, alone and pregnant, a 5-month-old baby asleep on her lap. I want her to be the heroine, riding toward the unknown with all of the virtue and strength and resilience we automatically ascribe to mothers, with no thought of the burden. I want to imagine the husband she left behind, endowing him with the will and power to move heaven and earth to keep his family whole. I want to write this story so that it's clear who is the hero and who is the villain, who deserves to parent and who does not. But in real life, those things are rarely as clear as in fairy tales. This is what I know. A pregnant woman with a 5-month-old baby got on a Greyhound bus to California with no money, one diaper, no food, and no hope. She felt broken. She didn't know her family was about to crash into a child welfare system that was just as broken. And I had no idea her family was on a collision course with mine. Or that life is rarely as simple as a love song.
It's so great. That's a good example of it's really good writing, Mark,
Thank you.
And such an informative book, and I think so impactful. There are a lot of books about people's experiences in foster care, and although all those stories are important, some of them are a little hard to read.
Yeah.
And you really do it. The way you put it on the page, it's super readable. It's super digestible. It's super informative. As I've said, it's also inspiring.
Thank
and
you.
I just am inspired by that. Really.
I have to say, Jane, it was when I first had the idea for the book, I had met with some friends who were lit agents, and I told them I want to write this, policy book on foster care, and they laughed. I'm like, oh, well, good luck getting anyone to read that. And they were right, and they were like, look, if you're going to write a book that is going to do, well, and people are going to actually read it, you're going to have to get really vulnerable. And so I tried to get very vulnerable, but I also knew in my head that, like, to be true to myself, I had to throw some humor in there. I had to be witty at times and make light of heavy situations at times, because otherwise it's just too much. It's too much. It was too much for me to live through, and it was too much for me to put on paper and expect a reader to actually sit with, So my husband's very funny, although I think I did him probably a disservice where wasn't sharing how funny he is in the book. But there's a lot of that stuff that, being parents is there's so many funny things that happen, and dealing with the system is sometimes all you can do is laugh. Otherwise, you're just going to cry, So I had tried to make it funny and engaging for that reason,
Yeah, well, it truly is. It's super readable.
Thank you.
I want to ask you one thing that I ask all my guests, and that is, what is the one thing that no one would ever know about you unless you told them?
Oh, well, if I answer that, then they'll all know. No, I don't know. I mean, I think, I joke about this all the time, and with one of my dear friends. So I guess this friend would know, but I actually, because of the way that I think I come across, a lot of things, people think that I'm very extroverted, but I'm actually really a introverted extrovert, where it takes me a lot of energy and so on to be out and to be engaging. I actually have to build up to that. It's not a natural thing.
That's interesting, because a lot of people actually have said that how much work it is to present as an extrovert when they're truly an introvert.
Yeah, I think so. I really enjoy my own time.
Right. So how has that affected how you have to deal with your children who want you all the time?
I think it's different with kids in the sense of, like, the day-to-day of it, right? I think it's more so like when we're, chaperoning birthday parties or field trips and that sort of stuff, where it comes into play,
Right, where you would just rather hang back and chill.
Yeah.
And but instead you got to be on.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It's also just funny. I mean, we were first-time parents in addition to being first-time foster parents, right? So it was like, all of this was new to us. And if you've been around new parents, they're neurotic, right? And we were just like them, except ours were 3 months and 13 months. So we really didn't know what to do.
You really didn't know, right? So is there anything else? Is there anything that you'd like to say to people who are considering either fostering or adopting, or fostering to adopt, or any and all that?
I would say, first of all, that I think that fostering and adopting are wonderful things that you could do, but they're not the only things you could do. And there's 400,000 kids across the country that are involved in the system with, millions who come in contact with it every year. I think there is something we can all do, whether it's as simple as voting for legislators who are prioritizing this, whether it's calling your representatives and telling them to not cut funding, or like Medicaid, which is, the insurance provider of every single child in foster care in the country. Things like that we could do that really don't take a lot of effort. There's higher lift things like become a CASA, like what you do, which is so beautiful, a court-appointed special advocate, where you go in and you really become the voice of a child in court. And then also, foster and adopt, of course, with those mentorship programs in all corners of the country. And of course, scholarships and other things you can donate to. There's a real wide, tall ladder of engagement of how you can get involved. So I'd encourage people to, certainly, we need more foster parents. And if you want to do that, thefosterparent.com is a site that I built that allows people to go in and be connected with an agency in their community. But you can also do a host of other things to help kids in foster care.
Thank you so much, Mark. Really, thank you. I think you're a really great guy. It's taken a long time to get us to record together, and I appreciate your patience, and I appreciate the love that you are sharing.
Thank you.
We all need that, right? We just need the love, and the fact that you and Jason have made yourself available to these kids that you now have, and your love, and they love you. It's pretty awesome.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for sharing your platform with all of us and allowing us the ability to share these stories. Obviously they're so important, and it means the world to me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for all you do, for being an advocate and adopting 3 beautiful children and becoming a father, giving back. And for those of you interested in Mark's nonprofit, thefosterparent.com, and also you can read his book called Safe, A Memoir of Fatherhood, Foster Care, and the Risks We Take for Family by Mark Daley. You can find that on Amazon. Keep an ear out for our next episode. Coming soon. Be well. If you or someone you know is harming themselves or thinking about harming themselves, go to crisistextline.org. If you see something, say something. If you suspect a child's health or safety is jeopardized in any way by parents or anyone else, contact the Child Protective Services Agency in your county. 24-hour hotlines are staffed by trained social workers who will help you through the process, and you can do so anonymously. In California, you can call the Child Protection Hotline at 800-540-4000. So if you see something, say something. You might be saving a child's life. If you want to know more about becoming a CASA anywhere in the country, go to nationalcasagal.org, and in LA, casala.org. And if you want to know more about becoming a foster parent, check out the National Foster Parent Association at nfponline.org. There's also faithfosterfamilies.org and adoptuskids.org. There's tons of other information online as well, so you can just hunt around. We also want to thank the supremely talented Christina Apostolopoulos for her beautiful original music. You can find her music on Spotify or Instagram at Christina Aposta. And also thank you to Yukon Har for his engineering. Thanks for listening, and if you like what you hear and you find it as valuable as we do, please rate us and hit subscribe. You can also make a donation at bonusbabies.org. See you next time.